In August of 2024, 18-year-old Mary Brooks drove into Yellowstone National Park, her trunk filled with professional camera gear and her mind focused on a photography scholarship that represented her entire future. 5 months later, on a morning so cold the Wyoming air felt like shards of glass, a figure stumbled into the police station in Jackson. She was barefoot, emaciated, and covered in a map of scars that told a story of a different kind of wilderness. Everyone, the park rangers, the FBI, her own grieving parents, believed Mary had died months ago in a tragic hiking accident. But the truth Mary brought back with her was far more terrifying. She hadn't been lost in the vastness of the park. She had been less than 3 miles away the entire time, held captive by someone who knew exactly how to disappear in plain sight. On August 18th, a Tuesday, the sun hit the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, providing the perfect golden hour Mary had traveled to capture. To the outside world, she was just another hiker. To the predator watching through binoculars, she was a target. Mary was experienced. She had filed her permits and shared her itinerary. Her last post to social media was a photo of her hiking boots against the canyon rim with the caption, "Day 1, Chasing Light." It would be the last light she would see for a long time. When Mary didn't check out of her campsite, the machinery of a modern search and rescue operation kicked in. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the pines. K9 units combed the trails. They found her silver sedan locked and untouched at Artist Point, her phone and wallet still inside. Then came the breakthrough that would end the search. A single hiking boot snagged on a jagged branch over a 1,000-foot drop into the canyon. The logic was cold and final. No one survives a fall like that. The search was suspended, the memorial service was planned, and Mary Brooks was filed away as a tragic statistic of the American wild. But as the winter snows buried Yellowstone in 5 months of silence, Mary wasn't under the snow. She was underneath the floorboards. On January 23rd, the dead returned. Security footage from the Jackson police station shows a woman who looked more like a collection of shadows than a person. Her gait was unsteady, shuffling as if each step required an impossible act of will. She didn't ask for help, she simply collapsed in the lobby. When the nurses at West Park Regional Hospital cut away her torn, oversized clothing, they found what the police reports would later call the map. Her body was covered in ligature marks, pale, deep indentations on her wrists and ankles that only come from months of being chained. She was skeletal, her ribs protruding through skin that had become almost transparent from lack of sunlight. She wouldn't speak her name at first. She only whispered one thing over and over, a phrase that chilled the attending detectives. "He told me the search stopped. He showed me my own obituary." The fingerprints confirmed the impossible. Mary Brooks was back. But as Detective Sarah Chen looked at the girl shivering under the hospital blankets, she realized the hardest part of the investigation wasn't finding where Mary had been. It was finding out who else David was still watching in the shadows of America's oldest national park. The air at the entrance to Yellowstone National Park on the morning of August 18th was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and the faint sulfurous promise of the geothermal basins further inland. For Mary Brooks, the smell didn't represent danger, it represented the beginning of her professional life. As she steered her silver sedan through the north entrance, the 18-year-old felt the weight of her Canon EOS 5D resting on the passenger seat like a silent partner. She was more than a tourist, she was a hunter of light. In 3 weeks, she was scheduled to move into her dorm at the University of Wyoming, and this solo expedition was the final piece of the puzzle for her portfolio, a high-stakes bid for a prestigious nature photography scholarship that would decide whether she could afford her sophomore year.
She had planned the trip with the meticulous precision of an engineer. Her backpack contained 2 liters of water, high-protein energy bars, a topo map she had highlighted in yellow, and a handheld GPS unit. To Mary, the wilderness was a place of rules and systems. If you followed the markers, stayed on the trails, and respected the boundaries, the park would reward you. She had emailed her parents a PDF of her itinerary, complete with GPS coordinates for her nightly campsites. She was the responsible one, the daughter who never missed a check-in, the girl whose independence was built on a foundation of careful preparation. She believed that being smart was the same thing as being safe. The drive toward the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone was a slow progression through some of the most sacred landscapes in America. She stopped briefly at the Lamar Valley to watch a herd of bison crossing the road, the massive animals moving with a prehistoric gravity that made her breath hitch. She didn't take her camera out yet. She was saving her film and her energy for the big one, Artist Point. The location was a cliché for a reason. The way the sun hit the lower falls at the perfect angle in the late afternoon created a spectrum of light that few places on Earth could replicate.
By the time she pulled into the gravel lot at Artist Point, the sun was beginning its slow descent. The parking lot was busy, filled with families in minivans and retired couples in RVs. This sense of communal wonder reinforced Mary's feeling of security. This wasn't a dark, forgotten corner of the world. It was a brightly lit stage where thousands of people stood in awe every day. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the familiar tug of her tripod against her spine, and began the hike. Her pace was steady and practiced. She moved past the crowded observation platforms, looking for a specific vantage point she had researched online, a slightly higher, less trafficked outcropping that offered a cleaner line of sight toward the falls. As she hiked, she took out her phone. The signal was weak, but she managed to upload one final image to her Instagram story. It was a shot of her worn hiking boots, the laces double knotted, resting on a flat stone overlooking the golden-hued canyon. The caption was simple, Day 1, Chasing Light. She hit send, watched the progress bar crawl to completion, and then tucked the phone into her pocket. She didn't know it was the last time she would ever touch a digital device. It was near the edge of a secondary trail that she first saw him. He wasn't a ranger, but he looked like he belonged there. He wore a tan vest over a green shirt, a wide-brimmed hat tilted back to reveal a friendly, sun-weathered face. He was holding a pair of high-end binoculars and had a volunteer badge clipped to his pocket. He looked like the personification of the National Park Service, helpful, authoritative, and deeply embedded in the landscape. "You're looking for the light on the falls, aren't you?" he asked, his voice a low, pleasant baritone that cut through the sound of the distant rushing water. Mary stopped, smiling. "Is it that obvious?" "The tripod gives it away," he said with a chuckle. "Most people stay on the main deck, but the spray from the falls ruins the lens clarity this time of day. There's a spot about half a mile up a maintenance spur. It's not on the public maps, but it gives you a profile of the canyon that looks like a Hudson River School painting. I usually only tell the serious photographers about it." Mary hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her itinerary said to stay on the marked trails, but he wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. He was a park volunteer, a guardian of this place. Her desire to get the impossible shot, the one that would win her the scholarship and prove she was a real professional, warped her judgment just enough. She looked at his badge, then back at his kind, crinkled eyes. "Half a mile?" she asked. 10 minutes, tops," he promised, stepping aside to reveal a narrow, shaded path that veered away from the main overlook. "I'm headed that way to check a bird nesting site. I can show you exactly where to set up your tripod." Mary thanked him, her heart light with the thrill of an insider's secret. She followed him into the shadows of the lodgepole pines, leaving the noise of the tourists behind.
She felt capable, she felt chosen, and she felt entirely safe. She was chasing the light, unaware that she was walking directly into the longest night of her life. The silence began as a clerical error on the morning of August 20th. At the Canyon Village campground, the checkout deadline of 10 a.m. passed without the silver sedan moving or the campsite being cleared. To the seasonal staff, it initially looked like a typical tourist oversight, someone lingering too long at a geyser basin or sleeping in after a long hike. But by noon, when the next reservation arrived to find Mary's tent still pitched and her stove cold on the picnic table, the tone shifted from annoyance to professional concern. A cursory check of the digital logs showed her park pass hadn't been scanned at any exit since her arrival. By 1 p.m., the welfare check had been elevated to a missing person report, and the clock, which had already been ticking for nearly 48 hours since her last social media post, began to accelerate with a terrifying momentum. In Ohio, the afternoon was unremarkable until the telephone rang. For Tom and Linda Brooks, that specific ringtone, the one associated with the long-distance area codes of the West, would forever be the sound of their lives splitting into before and after. The voice on the other end was measured, trained in the art of delivering devastating news with clinical calm. It was a lead ranger from the Yellowstone Emergency Communications Center. He didn't say Mary was dead. He used the word overdue. But to a parent who had received a meticulously detailed PDF itinerary only days prior, overdue felt like a euphemism for a nightmare. Mary was the girl who called when her plane landed 10 minutes early. She didn't just stay out in the wilderness. The transition from a normal Tuesday into a state of visceral, bone-deep terror happened in the space of a single sentence. Within 4 hours, the Brooks were at the airport, their lives reduced to the contents of 2 carry-on bags and a frantic, fragile hope that was already beginning to erode under the weight of the facts. By the time the sun began to set on August 20th, the first major physical breakthrough occurred. A patrol ranger, scanning the peripheral parking areas, spotted Mary's silver sedan in the gravel lot at Artist Point. It sat exactly where she had left it, the metal skin of the car hot from the high-altitude sun, looking hauntingly normal amidst the sea of other tourist vehicles. When investigators gained entry, the sense of dread solidified into a cold, hard reality. Her wallet was tucked neatly in the center console. Her professional camera bag was gone, but her smartphone, the device that held her day one post, lay on the passenger seat, its battery dead and its screen dark. To a search professional, a vehicle left with these items is a grave sign. It suggests the owner never made it back to the one thing that could connect them to help. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, just the echoing silence of an abandoned life.
The following morning, Yellowstone National Park transformed from a vacation destination into a tactical staging ground. The quiet majesty of the canyon was replaced by the rhythmic, percussive thrum of a Bell 407 helicopter, its crew leaning out of open doors with high-powered binoculars and thermal imaging sensors. The search was massive, an interagency effort that brought together specialized canine units from 3 states, technical rope rescue teams, and dozens of ground searchers in high-visibility vests. They moved in V-shaped lines through the dense lodgepole pines, their eyes trained on the ground for any deviation from the natural floor. A broken twig, a dropped lens cap, or the scuff of a hiking boot in the soft volcanic soil. The search dogs, highly trained bloodhounds with a specialized sense for human decomposition and live scent trailing, were given a scent article from the driver's seat of Mary's car. They led the handlers toward the main overlook of the falls, their tails wagging with the intensity of a fresh trail. But then, the trail became chaotic. Near the edge of a secondary maintenance path, the dogs began to circle, whining and snapping at the air in frustration.
The wind, which whipped through the canyon with unpredictable violence, was scattering the scent particles, pulling them down into the 1,000-foot abyss of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. To the handlers, it looked like the trail simply vanished into thin air at the very edge of the cliff. The psychological toll on the searchers was immense. Each day that passed without a sighting reduced the statistical probability of a live find. The high-altitude nights were dropping into the low 40s, and Mary had only been equipped for a day hike. As the search entered its 5th day, the hope that had sustained the volunteers took a terminal blow. A technical climbing team, rappelling into a section of the canyon wall that was almost entirely vertical and invisible from the rim, spotted a flash of synthetic color caught on a gnarled root of a Douglas fir. It was a single hiking boot. When the boot was brought to the surface in a sterile evidence bag, Tom Brooks felt the world tilt. It was a Merrill Moab, size 7.5, the exact model Mary had been wearing in the photograph she had posted to social media. The laces were torn, and the leather was scuffed, as if it had been dragged across serrated stone with immense force. To the lead investigators, the boot was the smoking gun. In the brutal logic of mountain SAR operations, a boot found on a cliff face below a trail is almost always evidence of a slip-and-fall accident. They surmised that Mary, in her pursuit of the perfect light, had stepped too close to a crumbling edge of rhyolite rock. The ground would have given way silently, sending her into a terminal tumble toward the Yellowstone River far below. The discovery of the boot shifted the geometry of the search from a rescue to a recovery. The prevailing theory was now fixed. Mary Brooks was in the river. The Yellowstone River, swollen with late summer snowmelt and moving with enough force to grind boulders into silt, was a graveyard. A body falling from that height into that current could be carried miles downstream into inaccessible caverns or pinned under heavy submerged timber. Forensic experts pointed to the location of the boot as a high-probability fall zone. Ground searches were expanded to hundreds of square miles, reaching into the deepest backcountry of the Washburn Range, but the urgency began to bleed out of the operation. The thermal imagers, so effective in the first 48 hours, now showed only the heat signatures of elk, bison, and the occasional grizzly bear moving through the undergrowth. The media coverage, which had initially been frantic and filled with theories of foul play, began to soften into the somber language of tragedy. The missing girl was becoming a lost soul. As the first dusting of early September snow hit the higher elevations, the park management sat down with the Brooks family in a wood-paneled briefing room. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee and unspoken grief. They spoke of diminishing returns and the unforgiving nature of the Yellowstone wilderness. They explained that the search would be transitioned to a passive phase, meaning they would no longer actively comb the woods, but would keep the case open for random discovery by hikers or rangers in the future. Tom and Linda Brooks sat in stunned silence, realizing that the world was moving on. The park would stay open, the tourists would keep snapping photos at Artist Point, and their daughter was being relegated to a folder in a filing cabinet. They were told that her body might not be found until the spring thaw, if ever. Everyone was looking at the bottom of the canyon, convinced that the river had claimed her. No one looked back toward the woods, toward the decommissioned maintenance buildings that stood in plain sight, or towards the friendly volunteer who had watched the search helicopters from a darkened window, a small, twisted smile on his face. He knew that as long as they found a boot, they would never think to look for a door. He had planted the evidence perfectly, and the wilderness had taken the blame for his crime.
By September 10, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the search operation had curdled into a heavy, bureaucratic stillness. The temporary command center at Canyon Village, once a hive of radio chatter and topographical maps pinned to every available surface, was being dismantled. The folding tables were stacked, the satellite uplinks were retracted, and the fleet of white government SUVs had begun to bleed away, returning to their respective districts. The 3-week mark was the point of no return for the National Park Service, a grim mathematical threshold where the cost of the search outweighed the statistical probability of a miracle. When the incident commander sat down to sign the final daily briefing, the atmosphere in the room wasn't one of resolution, but of weary defeat. The official transition of the case status was handled with the cold precision of a medical report. The medical examiner's assessment, drafted in a sterile office in Cheyenne, provided the legal scaffolding for the tragedy. Without a body, the determination had to rely on circumstantial physical evidence, and the single mangled hiking boot found on the canyon wall was the anchor for their conclusion. The report stated that the trajectory of a fall from the Artist Point Secondary Trail would involve multiple high-impact strikes against the rhyolite cliffs before a terminal entry into the Yellowstone River. At that velocity, the report noted, survival was not a biological possibility. The river's current, moving at several thousand cubic feet per second, was cited as the primary reason for the lack of remains. On the afternoon of September 10, the status of Mary Brooks was officially changed from missing to presumed deceased. For the media, the narrative was perfect in its tragedy. It was the man versus nature trope that sold newspapers and drove clicks. News segments featured B-roll of the churning lower falls, the water white and violent, while anchors spoke in hushed tones about the experienced hiker undone by the very wilderness she loved. They interviewed survival experts who lectured about the deceptive stability of canyon rims and the dangers of solo trekking. To the public, Mary Brooks became a cautionary tale, a beautiful, talented girl whose independence had ultimately been her undoing. The story was packaged, digested, and then slowly forgotten as the news cycle churned forward. But for Tom and Linda Brooks, there was no packaging of the grief. They remained in a rented cabin just outside the park boundaries for another week, living in a state of agonizing limbo. To be told your child is dead is one thing. To be told they are presumed dead while their bedroom back in Ohio still smells like their perfume is a specific, sharpened kind of torture. There was no body to wash, no casket to lower, no physical proof of the end. There was only the absence, a hollow, echoing space where Mary's future used to be. Every time the wind howled through the pines outside their cabin, Linda would startle, convinced she heard a voice. Every time a ranger's vehicle drove past, Tom would stand by the window, hoping for a different set of papers, a different truth. They were living in the in-between, a place where hope is a poison that keeps the wound from ever closing. In the midst of this official finality, Detective Sarah Chen of the Wyoming State Major Crimes Unit sat in her office, staring at a printout of Mary's final social media post. While the Park Service was satisfied with the slip and fall theory, Chen's mind was snagged on a series of small, jagged inconsistencies. She looked at the photo of the boots. The laces were double-knotted, tight, and professional. Mary was a girl who respected the equipment. Why would someone that careful step onto a crumbling ledge? Chen also noted the location of the vehicle. It was parked in a way that suggested Mary intended to return before dark. The seat was adjusted perfectly, and the camera bag was missing, but her phone, her most vital tool for navigation and safety, had been left behind. It didn't fit the profile of an experienced hiker. It felt like a stage set. Chen had spent a decade investigating the types of predators who frequent national parks, the ones who know that the vastness of the woods is the perfect cover for a different kind of violence.
She had requested the personnel files of all seasonal employees and volunteers who had been on duty at Artist Point that week, but without a body or evidence of a crime, her investigation was a desk file, something she worked on in the quiet hours between active cases. She had a gut feeling that was persistent as a low-grade fever. Mary Brooks hadn't fallen. She had been taken. But in the face of the medical examiner's report and the missing boot, her doubts were treated as a professional eccentricity, a refusal to accept a simple, tragic accident. As September turned to October, the seasons began to enforce their own brand of silence. The first true blizzard of the year swept through the Washburn Range, burying the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone under 3 feet of heavy, wet snow. The tourists vanished, the gift shops in Canyon Village boarded up their windows, and the park's interior roads were closed to wheeled vehicles, turning the landscape into a white, impenetrable fortress. October became November, and the cold deepened into something primitive. In the basement of the abandoned Canyon Village maintenance station, less than 3 miles from where the search teams had given up, the temperature hovered just above freezing. The snow outside acted as a soundproofing layer, muffling the world. While the Brooks family sat at a quiet, joyless table in Ohio, looking at Mary's empty chair, Mary was learning to track time by the vibration of the heavy snowplows clearing the main road in the distance. She was learning the sound of her captor's boots on the stairs, a rhythmic, heavy thud that meant either a meal or a lesson. By December, the Mary Brooks case was a memory for everyone but her parents and Detective Chen. The winter was brutal, with temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, making any thought of survival in the wilderness an absurdity. The Park Service archives now held the file, tucked between a report on elk population counts and a budget for road repairs. To the world, Mary was a ghost. To David Marsh, she was a project. He spent the long winter nights sitting in his apartment in Cody, scrolling through the photos he had taken of her. Not the ones she had taken of the canyon, but the ones he had taken of her while she was focused on her camera, unaware that the friendly volunteer was a predator who had been waiting for the right light to take her. In early January, the Brooks family finally reached their breaking point. The lack of closure was destroying them, and on the advice of a grief counselor, they decided to hold a memorial service. They chose a date near the end of the month, a symbolic gesture to say goodbye to the daughter the wilderness had swallowed. They printed programs with the photo Mary had taken of her boots, the chasing light image. They invited the searchers, the rangers, and the friends she should have been in college with. They were preparing to bury a girl they didn't have in a grave that would be empty. They didn't know that on the same morning they were picking out a headstone, 30 miles away in the town of Cody, a man was making a mistake. He was leaving a door unlocked, distracted by the coming storm, unaware that 5 months of calculated torment hadn't quite succeeded in breaking the girl he thought he had erased. As the world prepared to mourn her, Mary Brooks was starting to remember to breathe.
On the morning of January 23rd, at exactly 7:42 a.m., the town of Jackson, Wyoming was gripped by a cold so profound it felt as though the world had frozen mid-breath. The temperature sat at a lethal 12 degrees below zero, and a thin, crystalline fog hung over the streets, obscuring the jagged peaks of the Tetons. Inside the Jackson Police Department, Officer Elias Rodriguez was finishing a graveyard shift that had been defined by quiet streets and the low hum of the station's heating system. He was pouring a final cup of stale coffee when a movement through the thick glass of the front entrance caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the morning light or a stray animal disoriented by the freeze. But as the figure moved closer, emerging from the gray veil of the fog, Rodriguez felt a primal chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside.
The figure approaching the station did not look like a person so much as a shadow that had been stripped of its substance. She moved with a hitching, mechanical gait, her feet dragging through the accumulated powder of the sidewalk. Rodriguez dropped his coffee cup as he realized the woman was barefoot. Her feet were a terrifying shade of marble white and necrotic blue, unprotected against the frozen concrete. She was draped in a men's canvas work jacket that was several sizes too large, the sleeves frayed and stained with a mixture of grease and ancient dried mud. Beneath the jacket, a pair of oversized denim jeans was cinched to her waist with a length of dirty twine. As she reached the heavy glass doors, she didn't reach for the handle. She simply leaned her forehead against the pane, her breath failing to even fog the glass, as if there was no heat left in her lungs. Rodriguez sprinted toward the door, throwing it open just as the woman's knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the tile floor, and the first thing that struck him was the weight, or the lack of it. She felt like a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in frozen fabric. Her hair was a matted, chaotic nest of blonde and gray, tangled with bits of straw and dried pine needles. Her face was a hollowed-out mask of survival. The cheekbones protruded so sharply they looked ready to tear through the parchment-thin skin, and her eyes were sunken deep into dark, bruised sockets. She smelled of damp concrete, metallic chemicals, and the unmistakable, cloying scent of long-term neglect. "Help," she didn't say. The word didn't even form. She simply exhaled a rattling, shuddering sigh and lost consciousness in his arms. Within minutes, the quiet lobby was transformed into a frantic medical theater. The on-call EMTs arrived with a gurney, their breath pluming in the air as they worked to stabilize the stranger. As they cut away the stiff, frozen canvas of the men's jacket, the room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. The woman's body was a living ledger of systematic abuse. Her wrists and ankles weren't just bruised, they were ringed with thick, raised keloid scars, the permanent signatures of long-term metal restraints. Deep pressure sores pitted her hips and shoulder blades, and her skin was a mosaic of yellowish bruises and unhealed abrasions. When the lead paramedic checked her vitals, his voice was a tight whisper. Her blood pressure was crashing, her pulse was a thready, desperate flutter, and her core temperature was deep in the zones of severe hypothermia. She was a biological miracle, a heart that refused to stop beating despite every reason to fail. She was rushed to West Park Regional Hospital under a police escort, the sirens wailing through the empty, snow-choked streets. In the emergency room, the clinical staff worked with a grim, focused intensity. They administered warmed IV fluids and wrapped her in forced air warming blankets, trying to coax her body back from the brink of total system failure. For 3 hours, she remained a Jane Doe, a ghost who had walked out of the frost. It wasn't until the heat began to return to her limbs that she drifted back into a fragmented state of consciousness. A nurse, leaning close to check her pupil response, saw the woman's lips move. It was a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on wood. The nurse leaned in closer, her ear inches from the woman's mouth. "Mary," the ghost whispered. "Mary Brooks." The nurse froze. Every person in Wyoming knew that name. It was the name on the posters that had faded under the sun of August and the snow of October. It was the name of the girl whose memorial service was scheduled to take place in Ohio in less than 72 hours. It was a dead girl's name. The lead physician immediately called the station, and the message was relayed with an utter disbelief to the Major Crimes Unit. Detective Sarah Chen was at her desk, staring at a cold cup of tea when the phone rang. When she heard the name Mary Brooks, her first instinct was anger. She thought it was a cruel prank or a case of mistaken identity by a confused transient. But the officer on the other end was insistent. He had the mobile fingerprint scanner results.
The procedure had been standard for an unidentified victim, but the result was anything but. The digital interface had pinged the FBI's missing person database and returned a 100% biometric match. The red deceased/case closed flag on the file was being overwritten by the system in real time. The fingerprints belonged to the 18-year-old girl who had vanished from Artist Point 5 months ago, the girl who had been declared dead by the medical examiner, the girl whose single hiking boot was currently sitting in an evidence locker as proof of a fatal fall. Chen didn't wait for her coat. She grabbed her keys and ran for her car, her mind racing through the hundreds of miles of wilderness she had searched, the interviews she had conducted, and the silent, nagging feeling she'd had that the accident was a lie. As she drove toward the hospital, the sun began to break through the Wyoming fog, hitting the snow-covered peaks with a blinding, golden light. It was the same light Mary had been chasing in August. When Chen stepped into the intensive care unit, she saw the skeletal figure through the glass of the isolation room. Even through the bandages and the IV lines, the resemblance was hauntingly clear. It was the eyes, the same wide, intelligent eyes from the photography portfolio, though now they were filled with a 1,000-yard stare that suggested she was still looking at something terrible in the dark. Chen's phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a return call from the Brooks family in Ohio. She looked at the screen, her hand trembling. How do you tell a mother and father that the mourning they had finally accepted was a mistake? How do you explain that their daughter had spent the last 5 months living a nightmare less than 3 miles from where they had stood and wept for her? She stepped out into the hallway and pressed the phone to her ear. "Tom, it's Detective Chen," she said, her voice cracking. "I need you to sit down. We found her. Mary is alive." The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest thing Chen had ever heard. In that moment, the Mary Brooks case wasn't a file in a cabinet anymore. It was a hunt. Because if Mary was here, skeletal and scarred, it meant that the predator Chen had sensed in the shadows wasn't a theory. He was a man with a name, a man with a key, and a man who was currently realizing that his dead girl had just walked back into the world of the living. The transition from the frozen silence of the streets to the sterile, high-frequency hum of the West Park Regional Intensive Care Unit did little to ease the atmosphere of emergency. Mary Brooks lay beneath a mountain of heated blankets, yet she continued to shiver with a violence that made the hospital bed rattle against the floorboards. She was no longer a person in the eyes of the medical staff. She was a puzzle of catastrophic trauma. The initial physical exam, conducted behind drawn curtains, revealed the true geography of her 5-month disappearance. The doctors found more than just ligature scars on her wrists. They found the biological evidence of a life lived in a tomb. Her skin was a translucent gray, devoid of vitamin D, and her muscles had atrophied to the point where her legs looked like those of a much older, bedridden patient. There were chemical burns on her palms, likely from industrial cleaners, and deep, jagged lacerations on her feet that suggested she had run miles through the frozen backcountry without the protection of shoes. As the physical stabilization began, the psychological evaluation proved far more daunting. A trauma specialist was brought in to observe Mary, but the girl they found was barely present. She existed in a profound dissociation, her gaze fixed on the corner of the ceiling, her hands clutching the hospital sheets so tightly her knuckles were white. Whenever a door clicked shut or a tray was set down, Mary would flinch with such force that the heart monitor would spike into a frantic rhythm. She was hyper-vigilant, her eyes darting toward every movement with the panicked intensity of a prey animal that knows the predator is still in the room. She didn't speak in sentences. She spoke in jagged, terrifying fragments that fell from her lips like shards of broken glass. Detective Sarah Chen sat in a chair by the window, a notebook open on her lap, waiting for the moments when Mary's mind would clear enough to let a detail slip through the fog. The fragments were small, but they were devastating. Between bouts of silent weeping, Mary would mutter about the concrete floor and the smell of the river through the vents. Then her voice would drop to a terrified whisper as she spoke the words that confirmed Chen's darkest suspicions. He said, "No one was looking."
joking," Mary rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "David said I was already dead. He showed me the papers. He showed me the tombstone." The psychological warfare was evident in every movement Mary made. She refused to eat the broth the nurses brought until she was explicitly given permission 3 or 4 times by a person she perceived to be in authority. She asked if she was allowed to use the bathroom, and when the nurse told her she was free to do whatever she liked, Mary had a panic attack, unable to process the concept of autonomy after 150 days of total subjugation. She was physically free, but the internal cage David had built around her mind was still perfectly intact. She believed she was a ghost inhabiting a world that had already moved on, and the shame she felt for being lost was a palpable, suffocating weight. When the call came that Tom and Linda Brooks had arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere in the wing shifted from investigative to purely emotional. Watching the parents, who had aged a decade in 5 months, walk through the double doors of the ICU, they were vibrating with a mixture of hysterical relief and a terror that they were walking into a room with a stranger. When they entered Mary's room, the reaction was not the cinematic reunion one might expect. Mary didn't reach for them. She recoiled. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, her eyes wide and overflowing with tears, and her first words to her mother was an apology. "I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. I should have listened. I lost the scholarship, Mom. I'm so sorry." The shame was the most heartbreaking component of her trauma. She apologized for the search, for the cost of the helicopters, and for the grief she had caused. It was as if she believed her abduction was a failure of her own character, rather than a calculated act of evil. As her father held her hand, sobbing as he felt how thin her fingers had become, Mary whispered the ultimate victory of her captor's manipulation. "He told me I was already dead to everyone. He told me the park belonged to him and that the Rangers had closed the file. I thought I was haunting that room."
Detective Chen, standing in the corner, felt a cold, sharp focus settle over her. She began to map the fragments. David, a name. The ranger station, a location. 3 miles, a distance. She knew the park's decommissioned infrastructure better than most. Yellowstone was littered with ghost buildings, old maintenance sheds, seasonal housing units, and ranger stations that had been abandoned as the park's budget shifted over the decades. She pulled out a topographical map of the area surrounding Artist Point. 3 miles from the canyon rim, tucked into a dense stand of lodgepole pines that the search teams had skipped because it was too close to the road, sat an old Canyon Village maintenance station. It was a concrete structure, mostly underground, designed to withstand the crushing weight of Wyoming snow. It was a place that didn't appear on modern tourist maps. Chen began to cross-reference the name David with the park's employment records. She wasn't looking for current rangers. She was looking for the shadows, the volunteers, the seasonal workers, the men who had been dismissed but never truly left. She needed someone with keys, someone with a radio, someone who knew exactly where the blind spots in the surveillance cameras were. As she worked, she watched Mary interact with her parents, noting how the girl would look toward the door every 30 seconds, expecting the friendly volunteer to walk through and punish her for speaking. "He called it the list," Mary whispered later that evening, when her parents had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in the bedside chairs. "He had a list of names. He said I was the only one who survived the initiation." The statement hit Chen like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Mary Brooks. This was about a predator who had weaponized America's most trusted institution. David wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a hunter who had turned the National Park Service's own facilities into his private slaughterhouse. Chen knew they were running out of time. If David realized Mary had escaped and was talking, he wouldn't stay in Cody. He would disappear back into the millions of acres of wilderness he knew better than anyone. Chen closed her notebook and headed for the door, her radio crackling to life as she called in the tactical team. They had the who and they had the where. Now they just had to hope that the room Mary had escaped from didn't contain the evidence of other girls who hadn't been strong enough to walk through the snow barefoot. The fragments were finally coming together, and they were forming the shape of a monster. The mobilization began in the dead of night on January 24, a silent gathering of power in a wood-paneled briefing room at the Yellowstone Justice Center. The air was thick with the smell of scorched coffee and the chemical tang of gun oil. This was no longer a rescue mission, it was a forensic surgical strike. Representatives from the National Park Service, the FBI's Evidence Response Team, and Wyoming local law enforcement sat in rows, their faces illuminated by the harsh blue light of a digital projector. Detective Sarah Chen stood at the front, her eyes bloodshot but her voice steady as she synthesized the fragments of a nightmare into a tactical plan. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of pine and granite, but Mary's fragmented testimony had given them the magnet they needed to find it. The investigation team spent the first 4 hours of the morning meticulously reviewing the structural blueprints of every decommissioned building within a 5-mile radius of the Artist Point parking lot. Yellowstone is a vast landscape, but it is also a graveyard of abandoned infrastructure, relics of a 1960s building boom that had long since been reclaimed by the forest. Mary's descriptions, though delivered in the rhythmic cadence of trauma, were surgically precise. She had spoken of a concrete floor that never got warm, the lack of windows, and a specific, haunting detail: the sound of the Yellowstone River, not as a roar, but as a distant rhythmic vibration that she could feel in her teeth when she laid her head on the floor. One of the senior rangers, a man who had patrolled the canyon district for 30 years, leaned forward and tapped a point on the topographical map. He identified the old Canyon Village maintenance station, a heavy-set bunker decommissioned in 2012 following a series of structural failures and a shift in the park's logistics. It was a brutalist block of poured concrete, half submerged in a hillside to protect it from the crushing weight of winter avalanches. It was a place that didn't appear on modern tourist maps. As the clock ticked toward 5 a.m., the tactical team suited up in the white winter camouflage, their gear heavy and functional. They moved out in a convoy of specialized snowcats and tracked SUVs, the vehicles cutting through the deep crystalline powder of the interior park roads. The silence of the winter morning was absolute, broken only by the low growl of the engines and the occasional crack of a frost-laden branch snapping under its own weight. Detective Chen sat in the lead vehicle, her hand resting on the case file. She kept thinking about the single boot they had found on the cliff. She realized now that David hadn't just been lucky, he had been a choreographer of grief, using the park's own dangers to mask his presence. They reached the perimeter of the maintenance station just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. The building looked like a tombstone in the snow. To a casual observer, it was a ruin. The windows were boarded with weathered plywood, and the roof was sagging under a 4-foot drift of snow. But as the tactical team fanned out, their rifles held at ready, a younger deputy pointed his gloved hand toward a narrow access road that led to the rear loading bay. There, partially filled in by the previous night's light dusting, but still unmistakably clear, were fresh tire tracks. They were deep, aggressive treads, the kind made by a heavy-duty pickup truck or a modified ranger vehicle. The adrenaline in the group spiked, a collective realization that the monster was likely still nearby. They moved toward the rear basement entrance, their boots crunching softly in the snow. This was the door Mary must have stumbled through in her desperate barefoot flight. As they reached the heavy steel frame, the lead ranger stopped and signaled for the team to halt. He pointed to the locking mechanism. The original National Park Service hardware was rusted and seized, but a brand new heavy-duty master lock padlock had been bolted onto a fresh steel hasp. It was a glaring inconsistency, a piece of shiny modern security on a building that was supposed to be a hollow shell. It was the mark of a squatter who considered himself an owner. The breach was sudden and violent. A specialized hydraulic tool was used to snap the padlock, the sound of the metal shearing through the silent woods like a gunshot in the silent woods. 2 officers stepped forward and heaved the heavy steel door open. It groaned on its hinges, a sound that Mary must have heard every day for 5 months. The smell hit them first. It wasn't the smell of the wilderness or the clean, cold Wyoming air. It was a thick, suffocating wall of sensory assault. It was the stench of unwashed bodies, of old blood, of concentrated bleach, and the metallic tang of rust. But underneath all of that was something even more disturbing, the smell of a domestic life gone horribly wrong. The air was stale and recycled, tasting of the copper-scented dampness that Mary had described in the hospital.
As the officers clicked on their high-lumen tactical lights, the beams cut through a swirling cloud of dust and dander, illuminating a scene that made even the most veteran detectives turn their heads in disgust.
The basement was a cathedral of calculated cruelty. In the center of the room, bolted directly into a structural concrete pillar, was a heavy steel chain. The links were worn smooth in the center, and the floor around the base of the pillar was scuffed in a perfect circle, a tethering track that told the story of Mary's limited world. A thin, stained mattress lay on the floor, its edges frayed. On the far wall, a series of shelves had been neatly organized with canned goods, bottled water, and piles of discarded female clothing. It was the juxtaposition of the mundane and the horrific that was most unsettling. On a small folding table, they found a stack of newspapers. Every single one of them was from the weeks following Mary's disappearance. They were opened to the pages featuring her search, the headlines about the fatal fall, and the eventually published obituary. Beside the papers lay a small, high-end digital camera, the mate to the professional gear Mary had lost. Detective Chen stepped forward, her gloved hand trembling as she picked up a piece of paper pinned to the wall. It was a schedule, written in a precise, neat hand. It dictated when the subject was allowed to sleep, when she was allowed to eat, and a list of rules for the photography sessions. The team realized with a jolt of pure horror that this wasn't just a prison, it was a studio. David Marsh hadn't just been holding Mary, he had been documenting her destruction. He had been chasing the light in a way that was a grotesque parody of her own passion. As the forensic team began to process the scene, Chen looked toward the back of the room, where a second, smaller door led deeper into the sub-basement. She realized that the tire tracks outside meant David had left, but he wasn't far. He had left his home exactly as it was, likely on a supply run, unaware that his dead girl had finally broken the silence of Yellowstone. The hunt was no longer about finding a location. It was about finding a man who was currently moving through the park with a truck full of supplies and a heart full of secrets. Chen looked back at the chain on the floor and made a silent vow. They would find David Marsh before the sun set on the Wyoming snow, where she would never leave these woods again. The flashlights of the tactical team cut through the stagnant air of the basement like blades, illuminating a crime scene that felt less like a room and more like a psychological autopsy. Detective Sarah Chen stepped onto the damp concrete, her boots making a gritty, scraping sound that seemed loud enough to shatter the oppressive stillness. This was the black box of Mary's lost 5 months, a windowless tomb where time had been systematically dismantled. The beam of Chen's light landed first on the structural support beam in the center of the room, a massive salt-stained pillar of reinforced concrete. Bolted into its center was a heavy-gauge steel eye bolt, and from it hung 3 feet of industrial chain. The metal was polished to a high shine in the middle, worn down by the constant, desperate friction of a human ankle. The sheer domesticity of the horror was what made Chen's stomach turn. Next to the pillar lay a thin, water-damaged mattress, stripped of any sheets, resting directly on the cold floor. In the corner sat a plastic utility bucket, and beside it a stack of industrial-sized containers of bleach and lye, the chemicals Mary had been forced to use to scrub away the evidence of her own existence. There were no windows, no clocks, and no calendars. The only light source was a single, bare 40-watt bulb hanging from a frayed wire, controlled by a switch on the outside of the door. David Marsh had been the master of her circadian rhythms, deciding when her day began and when her world vanished into total darkness. By stripping away the ability to track time, he had effectively erased her connection to the living world, turning months into a single agonizing now. The walls of the basement served as the predator's manifesto. Taped to the concrete with surgical precision were sheets of paper protected by plastic sleeves. They contained Marsh's general orders. The handwriting was small, cramped, and terrifyingly neat. Rule 1, silence is a privilege. Rule 4, gratitude is the only acceptable response.
Below the rules hung a meticulously detailed schedule that carved Mary's day into increments of labor and reflection. It was a blueprint for total psychological collapse, designed to replace Mary's identity with that of a compliant object. As the FBI evidence technicians began to move through the space, their camera flashes strobing against the dark walls, they uncovered the supply stockpile that had allowed Marsh to maintain this secret world. Stacks of generic canned meat, 5-gallon jugs of water, and a mountain of empty protein bar wrappers suggested a man who had planned for a multi-year occupation. He hadn't just been hiding, he had been homesteading in hell. In a small recessed alcove that Marsh had apparently used as an archive, Chen found the most damning piece of physical evidence. Sitting atop a wooden crate as if it were a trophy on a pedestal was a single mud-caked Merrill hiking boot. It was the left one. The right boot was currently sitting in a sterile evidence locker 40 miles away, the proof of Mary's death. Seeing the mate to the canyon boot here in this suffocating basement was the final undeniable confirmation of Marsh's staging. He had calculated the physics of the fall, planted the evidence, and then sat back to watch the world mourn a girl who was still breathing just 3 miles away. The hunt took a frantic turn when one of the tech officers reached into a secondary storage bin and pulled out a high-end Nikon camera, not Mary's, but one Marsh likely used to document his sessions. When the officer checked the memory card, he found thousands of photos. They weren't landscapes. They were high-resolution studies of Mary in various stages of her ordeal. Mary sleeping on the concrete, Mary eating from a plastic bowl, Mary's face illuminated by a single candle. Marsh wasn't just a kidnapper, he was a director of trauma, capturing her slow decline with the same professional eye Mary had used to photograph the Yellowstone Falls. The realization that he had likely been watching her through a lens for years before the abduction sent a wave of nausea through the team. But as the forensic sweep intensified, a chilling fact became apparent. The room was cold, but the air wasn't. The faint scent of wood smoke lingered in the upper ventilation ducts, and a half-eaten sandwich sat on a workbench in the corner, the bread not yet stale. David Marsh hadn't abandoned this place weeks ago. He had been here this morning. The fresh tire tracks outside weren't a memory, they were a trail. The realization hit Detective Chen like a physical blow. Marsh knew the perimeter had been breached. He likely saw the convoy approaching through the trees, or had been monitoring a hidden trail cam. He was gone, and he had a head start.
Manhunt protocols are active, the lead ranger shouted into his radio, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Notify the east and south exits. We are looking for a white 2018 Ford F-150 with Park Service decals, likely fraudulent. Subject is David Marsh, armed and extremely dangerous. Do not approach alone. The atmosphere in the room shifted from the clinical silence of an evidence search to the high-voltage electricity of a pursuit. Maps were spread across the workbench, covering Marsh's neat schedules. They began analyzing the sensor deprivation Marsh had used on Mary. He had blocked all external noise except for a small high-frequency radio he used to play white noise. He had kept her in a state of constant sensory confusion, making it impossible for her to tell if it was noon or midnight. This was why she had been so disoriented at the hospital. She was literally relearning how to perceive the world. Chen stood by the support beam, her hand hovering near the chain. She could see the deep gouges in the concrete where Mary had tried to dig her way out with her fingernails. The room was a testament to the absolute power one human can exert over another when they have the benefit of isolation and institutional knowledge. Marsh had used the park's own decommissioned history to build a kingdom of one. Every empty water bottle, every stained blanket, and every rule taped to the wall was a brick in a prison that should have been discovered months ago if the system had worked. As the tactical teams poured out of the building to begin the sweep of the surrounding woods, Chen stayed for one final moment. She looked at the single boot on the crate. She thought about Mary, shivering in the hospital, apologizing for losing her scholarship.
The rage that had been simmering in Chen's chest finally boiled over. Marsh hadn't just stolen 5 months of a girl's life. He had tried to steal her soul, documenting the process with the cold detachment of a scientist. The sun was now fully up, the bright Wyoming light reflecting off the snow outside, but inside the basement, the darkness seemed to cling to the corners. They had found the room, they had found the evidence, and they had found the horror. Now they had to find the man. Detective Chen turned her back on the chain and walked toward the light, her hand on her holster, knowing that David Marsh was somewhere in those millions of acres of white wilderness, and he was no longer the one doing the hunting. While the tactical team scoured the frozen undergrowth around the Canyon Village maintenance station, a second digital front opened in the basement of a nondescript apartment complex in Cody, Wyoming. This was the primary residence of David Marsh, and to the FBI computer forensics team that breached his door, the space felt like the nerve center of a spider's web. The apartment was obsessively clean, smelling of pine-scented floor wax and military-grade CLP oil. There were no personal photographs on the walls, no mementos of a life lived with others. Instead, the walls were lined with shelves of meticulously organized binders, each one labeled with dates and locations within Yellowstone National Park. As the forensic analysts bypassed the encryption on his dual-monitor workstation, the true nature of the predator began to emerge from the digital darkness. David Marsh was not an outsider to the park. He was a phantom created by the system itself. He had served as a seasonal Park Service employee from 2008 to 2015, working primarily in maintenance and trail reconstruction. This tenure had granted him the 2 things a predator needs most: total institutional knowledge and a set of master Ps that never should have stayed in his possession. During those 7 years, Marsh had mapped every decommissioned structure, every dead zone where radio signals failed, and every secondary trail that the tourists ignored. He didn't just know the park, he knew its weaknesses. He knew exactly which buildings were slated for demolition and which ones were so buried in administrative red tape that no one would check the locks for a decade. The forensics team discovered that Marsh's obsession had a clear inflection point. In 2015, he had been quietly dismissed following a series of reports concerning inappropriate conduct with female solo hikers near the Lamar Valley. The victims had described a man who was overly helpful, a man who seemed to appear out of the trees to offer insider tips on where to find the best views or the most elusive wildlife. At the time, no formal charges were filed. The Park Service, wary of a public relations scandal and lacking physical evidence of a crime, had simply opted not to renew his contract. They had let a wolf walk away from the flock, assuming that removing his badge would remove the threat. They hadn't realized that Marsh didn't need the badge to be a ranger. He only needed the costume and the trust that the uniform inspired. As the analyst scrolled through his hard drives, the scale of his predation became sickeningly clear. There were thousands of gigabytes of surveillance footage and long-lens photography. Mary Brooks was not a random victim of opportunity. She was the culmination of years of practice. Marsh's digital folders were organized by candidate. There were folders for dozens of women, hikers, photographers, and researchers who had visited the park over the last 3 years. He had photos of them at trailheads, photos of them eating lunch at overlooks, and photos of them sleeping in their tents, taken from hundreds of yards away with high-powered telephoto lenses. Mary was the first target he had successfully harvested. The evidence showed that Marsh had been watching Mary from the moment her silver sedan passed through the north entrance on August 18th. He had captured her on camera as she stopped to watch the bison, noting her solo status and her high-end camera equipment. To a man like Marsh, Mary was the perfect subject, independent, focused, and trusting of the environment. He had shadowed her to the Artist Point parking lot, waited for her to distance herself from the main tourist crowds, and then made his move. He didn't use a mask or a weapon. He used a smile and a volunteer's vest. The reconstruction of the abduction was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Marsh had approached Mary with the practiced ease of a local expert, offering her access to a secret photography spot. He had led her less than half a mile away into a stand of thick timber, where the topography muffled the sound of the falls. There, according to the physical evidence found in his kit, he had used a high-voltage stun device to incapacitate her instantly. While Mary lay unconscious, he had systematically begun the process of erasing her. He didn't kill her, he staged her death. He had taken her right hiking boot, walked to a treacherous, crumbling section of the canyon rim, and snagged it on a Douglas fir root in a way that mimicked a violent fall. He knew the psychology of search and rescue. They would find the boot, assume the river had the body, and stop looking.
After planting the evidence, he had carried Mary's limp body to his modified truck, a vehicle he had outfitted with fraudulent Park Service decals, and driven her less than 3 miles to the maintenance station. He had done it in broad daylight, passing search teams that were already beginning to organize. Because he looked like he belonged, because he drove a truck that looked official, no one stopped him. He had hidden her in the basement he had been prepping for years, a space he had soundproofed with industrial foam and reinforced with steel. But as the digital evidence revealed his past, the real-world manhunt was closing in on his present. Marsh had been monitoring a police scanner and realized the moment the ghost had walked into the Jackson station. He had fled the maintenance station in a panic, but his arrogance was his undoing. He believed his knowledge of the backcountry made him invisible. He hadn't accounted for the network of license plate readers that had been installed at the park's perimeters in the years since his dismissal. At 11:14 a.m., his truck was flagged moving east toward the Shoshone National Forest. The end came not in the wilderness, but in the mundane setting of a budget motel 60 miles away in the town of Graybull. Marsh had checked in under a false name, likely intending to switch vehicles and flee the state under the cover of the coming snowstorm. But Detective Chen and a team of state troopers had already bracketed the area. When they breached his room, they found David Marsh sitting on the edge of the bed, a packed bag at his feet and a handgun on the nightstand. He didn't put up a fight. He didn't even look surprised. He looked like a man who had finally finished a long, exhausting piece of work. As they led him out in handcuffs, the town was silent, the winter sun bright and accusatory on the snow. In his pocket, they found a small laminated photograph, the one Mary had posted of her hiking boots. On the back, in his neat, cramped handwriting, he had written, "The girl who chased the light." He hadn't just taken her freedom, he had attempted to own her story. But as Marsh was pushed into the back of the patrol car, Detective Chen looked at the camera gear being seized from his truck. The predator was caught, the ranger was unmasked, and for the first time in 5 months, the truth was no longer buried under the snow of Yellowstone. The man who knew how to disappear had finally run out of places to hide. The testimony of Mary Brooks did not come in a single coherent flood, but in a series of agonizing shallow breaths delivered over 3 days in a quiet, dimly lit hospital annex. Beside her sat a trauma counselor, a woman whose presence acted as a human anchor, holding Mary in the present whenever her eyes began to glaze over, a sign that her mind was retreating back to the basement. Detective Sarah Chen sat across from them, her digital recorder red light active, capturing the soft, rhythmic cadence of a survivor reconstructing her own erasure. Mary spoke with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice a thin wire that threatened to snap whenever she mentioned the name David. It began on the afternoon of August 18th, a day that Mary remembered as a mosaic of gold and blue. She described the friendly ranger with a clarity that was chilling. He hadn't just been a man in a vest, he had been a beacon of safety in an unfamiliar landscape. He spoke to her about apertures, shutter speeds, and the specific way the granite of the canyon reflected the late summer light. He used the language of her own passion to lower her guard.
Mary recounted the walk into the timber, the way the sound of the tourists' voices faded until there was only the wind in the lodgepole pines. She remembered the exact moment the air changed, the sudden jagged realization that they had walked too far from the trail. She had turned to ask how much further, and that was when the world ended. The stun device had been a sudden white-hot explosion in her nervous system, a lightning bolt that bypassed her brain and went straight to her muscles. She described the sensation of her bones turning to liquid, the taste of copper in her mouth, and then the absolute terrifying velvet of unconsciousness. When she woke, she was no longer the girl who had arrived at Yellowstone. She was a body in the dark. Mary described the disorientation of those first few hours with a clinical detachment that the detectives shuddered. She had reached out to touch her face and felt the cold, unyielding weight of the chain. She didn't know where she was or how much time had passed. The only constant was the damp, mineral smell of concrete and the sound of a heavy steel door opening somewhere above her. David Marsh would enter the room carrying a single lantern, the light casting monstrous shadows against the bunker walls. He didn't start with violence, he started with truth. He sat in a folding chair just out of her reach and told her with a voice full of manufactured pity that her disappearance had been a tragedy for everyone involved. The psychological warfare was Marsh's true masterpiece. He didn't just isolate her physically, he isolated her from the very idea of being missed. By the second week, he began bringing her proof. He showed her printouts of news articles he had meticulously altered, headlines that claimed her body had been spotted by a drone in the river, or that the search had been officially called off due to a lack of leads. He even showed her a photograph of a floral arrangement at a local church, telling her it was from her own memorial service. "He wanted me to believe I was a ghost," Mary whispered, her fingers tracing the scars on her wrists. "He told me that if I walked out that door, my parents would scream because they'd think they were seeing a monster. He said he was the only one who could look at me without flinching." His system of control was a grotesque clockwork of reward and punishment, centered on the most basic human needs. Food and water were not rights, they were currencies. If Mary spoke without being spoken to, or if she failed to maintain the posture of gratitude Marsh demanded, the single light bulb would remain dark for 48 hours. She described the sensory deprivation as a physical weight, the way the darkness began to feel like a thick, heavy wool pressing against her eyes. When she was good, he would bring her a bottle of clean water or a single lukewarm meal from a local fast food joint. These small mercies were designed to make her view him as a provider rather than a captor. He justified the entire ordeal as an act of salvation. He told her that her dangerous independence had nearly killed her at the canyon, and that by keeping her here, he was protecting her from a world she wasn't equipped to navigate. He was saving her by destroying her.
To survive, Mary created a safe room inside her own mind, a mental vault where the real Mary Brooks, the photographer and the daughter, was kept under lock and key. She told the investigators how she began to track time not by a calendar, but by the subtle shifts in the moisture on the walls and the specific types of canned food Marsh would bring. She memorized the lyrics to every song she had ever heard, reciting them in her head to keep her language from eroding. She became a master of compartmentalization, performing the role of the compliant captive while her core self watched from a distance, waiting for a crack in the armor. She survived by becoming invisible to herself, a strategy that kept her sane but left her feeling like a stranger in her own skin once she was finally rescued. The turning point, the moment the survival instinct overrode the fear, came in mid-January. The routine of the basement changed. Marsh began to talk about permanent arrangements. He spoke about the maintenance station being scheduled for a structural survey in the spring, and said they would need to move to a more final location deeper in the Shoshone wilderness. He began bringing in heavy-duty plastic sheeting and industrial zip ties, his conversations turning toward the idea of preserving her beauty forever. Mary realized then that the salvation he had promised was entering its terminal phase. He wasn't planning on keeping her alive once the snow melted. He was planning a finale. "He stopped looking at me like a person," Mary said, her voice finally cracking as she reached the end of her testimony. "He started looking at me like a photograph he was finished taking. I knew that if I didn't leave then, I would become part of the building." The testimony concluded with a heavy, respectful silence in the room. Detective Chen turned off the recorder, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had heard. Mary Brooks had spent 158 days in a concrete tomb, subjected to a level of psychological torture that would have broken most adults. Yet she had held on to a sliver of her identity, a small light that David Marsh hadn't been able to extinguish. As Mary leaned back into her pillows, exhausted by the effort of remembering, Chen realized that the shocking truth wasn't just about the predator's cruelty, it was about the terrifying, resilient strength of the girl who had refused to die, even after the world had already buried her. On the evening of January 22nd, the meticulous clockwork of David Marsh's obsession finally developed a fatal flaw. The mistake was born of a mundane distraction. A localized blizzard was rolling in from the Absaroka Range, and Marsh, hurried by the prospect of blocked roads, had rushed his weekly supply drop. In his haste to secure his vehicle against the rising wind, he pulled the heavy steel door of the maintenance station shut, but the internal deadbolt failed to catch. For Mary, sitting in the absolute darkness of the sub-basement, the sound was subtle, not the final echoing thud of a secured lock, but a hollow metallic click that didn't quite land. For nearly an hour, she sat perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the sound of his boots returning to rectify the error, but there was only the low, mournful whistle of the wind through the ventilation pipes. The 5 months of calculated torment had been designed to make her believe that movement was a sin and that the door was an impassable boundary. But the permanent arrangements Marsh had mentioned the night before had acted as a catalyst. The fear of staying had finally become greater than the fear of the man. The survival instinct she had carefully stored in the safe room of her mind suddenly surged, flooding her weakened limbs with a desperate electric heat. She stood up, the heavy chain rattling against the concrete pillar. She had learned the exact length of her tether over 158 days. She knew that if she strained until the iron bit into her skin, she could just barely touch the edge of the workbench. Her movement was frantic but silent. She stretched her arm, her fingers clawing at the shadows, until they brushed against a cold, oily piece of metal, a discarded flathead screwdriver Marsh had used to pry open crates of canned meat. It was a crude tool, but to Mary it was a key. The next 3 hours were a testament to human endurance and the refusal to be erased. Mary sat on the cold floor, hunched over the heavy steel shackle that encircled her left ankle. The lock was a weathered pad-eye mechanism, caked with dirt and rust. With the single-minded focus of the photographer she used to be, she began to work the screwdriver into the tumblers. Her fingers were numb, her vision blurred by the dim 40-watt bulb, and her muscles cramped in the freezing air, but she didn't stop. She whispered to herself, not prayers, but technical details. Focus the lens, steady the tripod, capture the light. She was focusing her entire existence into the tip of that metal tool. When the lock finally snapped open, the sound was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The weight of the chain fell away, leaving her ankle light and strangely vulnerable. She stood up, her balance wavering. Her body was a skeletal wreck, her muscles atrophied from months of limited movement, and her mind was a fragmented map of trauma. But as she pushed against the heavy steel door, it swung open into the sub-zero night.
The transition from the basement to the Wyoming winter was a physical assault. The air was 12 degrees below zero, a temperature that freezes exposed skin in minutes. Mary stepped out into the knee-deep powder, her bare feet instantly losing sensation as the snow packed between her toes. She had no coat, only the oversized canvas jacket Marsh had left behind. She didn't know which way was Jackson or which way was the park entrance. The world was a chaotic blur of white and gray, the moonlight reflecting off the snow with a blinding silver intensity. She began to walk. Every step was an act of defiance against the physics of her own exhaustion. She moved through the dense lodgepole pines, the branches catching on her hair and tearing at her face like fingers. She was disoriented, her internal compass shattered by 5 months of sensory deprivation. She saw shapes in the shadows, the ghosts of the girls Marsh had mentioned, the others who hadn't made it out. She felt the cold begin to seep into her core, the onset of hypothermia bringing a deceptive, seductive warmth that told her it was okay to sit down, okay to sleep, okay to give up. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice a frozen rasp. "You are Mary Brooks. You are not a photograph. You are real." She tracked her movement by the lights of the distant town, a faint amber glow on the horizon that looked as far away as the stars. She had to navigate 3 miles of lethal terrain, crossing frozen creek beds and dodging the shadows of predators that moved through the winter night. She fell repeatedly, her knees bruising against hidden rocks, her hands clawing her way back up, but the survival instinct that Marsh had tried to crush was now a roaring furnace. She wasn't just walking toward safety, she was walking away from the person she had become in that basement. As she reached the outskirts of Jackson, the world began to flicker. The amber lights became halos of fire, and the sound of the wind was replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She saw the blue and red neon of a motel sign, the headlights of a passing truck, and finally the sturdy brick silhouette of the police station. It looked like a sanctuary from another life.
She stumbled toward the glass doors, her gait a shuffling, mechanical wreck. In those final moments, a flashback hit her with the force of a physical blow, the memory of the last time she had stood in that basement. She remembered looking at the mattress, the bucket, and the chain, and making a silent pact with the darkness. She realized that the girl who had walked into Yellowstone in August, the confident photographer with the bright future, was gone. That girl had died in the first week. The person walking through the snow now was someone new, someone forged in the dark and tempered by the cold. She was leaving the victim behind in the concrete tomb, shedding that skin like a winter coat she no longer needed. She reached the door and leaned her forehead against the glass. The heat of the building felt like a miracle against her frozen skin. She didn't have the strength to pull the handle. She just waited for the world to see her. When the door finally opened and Officer Rodriguez caught her, Mary felt the final tether to the basement snap. She was free, but as she lost consciousness in the warm, bright lobby, she knew the 3-mile walk through the snow was only the beginning. She had escaped the room, but the cold would stay in her bones for a long time. She had left David Marsh's prison, but she was now an inhabitant of a new internal landscape, a place where the light was always shifting and the shadows always held a name. She had survived the breaking point, and in the silence of the station, the ghost of Mary Brooks finally began to breathe again. The Teton County Courthouse in April was a study in sharp contrasts, much like the case that had brought the world's attention to its doorstep. Outside, the spring thaw was beginning to crack the ice on the Snake River, but inside the courtroom of the People versus David Marsh, the atmosphere remained frozen in the clinical chill of the evidence. The gallery was packed with journalists, park rangers, and a public that had spent the winter oscillating between horror and disbelief. At the center of the storm sat David Marsh. Stripped of his tan volunteer vest and sun-weathered hat, he looked startlingly ordinary in a cheap suit, his face a mask of detached professorial calm.
He watched the proceedings not as a defendant, but as an observer of his own handiwork, occasionally adjusting his glasses as the prosecution began to dismantle the secret life he had built in the shadows of the pines. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of overwhelming, undeniable physical reality. The lead prosecutor didn't start with rhetoric, he started with the chain. He held the heavy industrial links aloft, the metal clinking with a sound that felt like a physical blow to everyone in the room. He presented the forensic mapping of the basement, the tethering track worn into the concrete, the DNA-matched blood on the mattress, and the fingerprints on the bleach bottles. Then came the digital evidence, a harrowing descent into the predator's mind. Analysts displayed Marsh's surveillance logs, showing that he hadn't just targeted Mary, but had indexed her like a specimen. They presented his staged accident plan, a document found on his encrypted drive that detailed the exact location where he would plant the single hiking boot to mislead search teams. It was proof of a premeditation so cold it made the slip and fall theory look like a grotesque joke. To establish the depth of Marsh's predation, the prosecution called upon a string of witnesses from his past, women hikers who had encountered the friendly volunteer years prior. One by one, they described the same pattern, the unsolicited advice on trails, the unsettling intensity of his gaze, and the way he seemed to know their names before they were introduced. These women had escaped through luck or intuition, their complaints filed away in the inappropriate conduct folders that the Park Service had failed to act upon. Seeing them stand together turned Marsh from a singular anomaly into a systematic failure of institutional trust. The defense, desperate and flailing, attempted to paint a picture of a consensual, if unconventional, relationship. They claimed Mary had been a willing participant, seeking to escape the pressure of her college life, and that she had stayed voluntarily in the maintenance station. It was a strategy of victim blaming that lasted less than an hour before the physical evidence, the shackles, the malnutrition reports, and the locked steel door rendered it absurd. The emotional heart of the trial arrived when Mary Brooks took the stand. The room fell into a silence so absolute it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the chamber. Mary looked different than she had in the August photographs. Her thinner, her eyes held a permanent weight, and she wore long sleeves to hide the scars that refused to fade. But as she began to speak, her voice didn't tremble. Supported by the steady gaze of Detective Sarah Chen in the front row, Mary described the systematic abuse of the last 5 months. She detailed the rules, the sensory deprivation, and the way Marsh had used the news of her own death to break her spirit. She spoke of the night she heard the door failed to lock and the 3-mile walk through the snow that had saved her life. As she spoke, she looked directly at Marsh. For the first time in the trial, the predator looked away. The closing arguments focused on the legal pillars of the crime: kidnapping, aggravated assault, and false imprisonment. But the prosecutor went further, framing the case as an assault on the very idea of the American wilderness. He argued that Marsh hadn't just harmed a girl, he had poisoned a sanctuary. Then came the victim impact statements. Tom and Linda Brooks stood before the bench, their voices thick with the residue of 5 months of mourning a child who was still alive. They described the limbo of the lost, the way they had picked out a headstone and written an obituary, and the permanent rewiring of their nervous systems that meant they could never look at a forest again without seeing a graveyard. They spoke of the daughter they had sent to Yellowstone, the girl who loved the light, and the survivor they had received back, who now lived in a perpetual world of shadows. When the jury returned after only 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict was a foregone conclusion, no less powerful for its predictability. Guilty on all counts. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom 11 times, a rhythmic hammer strike against Marsh's legacy of control. During the sentencing phase, the judge, a man known for his stoic adherence to the law, allowed his professional veneer to crack. He looked at Marsh, who remained expressionless even as the handcuffs were tightened for the final time. "Mr. Marsh," the judge began, his voice echoing in the rafters, "you did not merely commit a series of heinous crimes. You weaponized trust in one of America's most sacred spaces. You took the symbols of our collective heritage, the uniform, the badge, the very ground of our oldest national park, and you turned them into tools of a private, calculated hell. You relied on the goodness of others to facilitate your evil. For the 5 months of life you stole from Mary Brooks, and for the lifetime of peace you have stolen from her family, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will never see the sun set over a canyon again. You will live the remainder of your days in the very kind of windowless box you built for another."
As Marsh was led from the room, he didn't look back. He was a man who had finally been trapped by his own meticulously documented history. Mary sat between her parents, her eyes closed, breathing in the air of a room that was finally free of his presence. The trial was over. The justice was served on paper, and the predator was officially removed from the world of the living. But as the Brooks family walked out of the courthouse and into the bright April afternoon, they knew that while the law was finished with David Marsh, Mary's journey out of the basement was only entering its next, most difficult phase. The monster was behind bars, but the light she had been chasing in August still felt a very long way off. 6 months had passed since the snowblind morning when Mary Brooks walked out of the nightmare and back into the world. Yet time had not behaved the way the recovery brochures promised it would. In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, the passage of days felt less like a linear progression toward healing and more like a slow, circular orbit around a central void. Physically, the transformation was startling to those who hadn't seen her in the hospital. The skeletal hollows of her cheeks had filled in, and the translucent gray pallor of her skin had been replaced by a healthy, if muted, glow. She had regained the weight, her body once again possessing the strength to move through a room without trembling. But the physical restoration was a deceptive surface. The scars on her wrists and ankles had faded to a silvery, jagged white, permanent raised maps of a geography she could never truly leave behind. To Mary, her body felt like a house that had been broken into and stripped. It looked the same from the street, but the locks were different, and the sense of sanctity was gone. The psychological recovery was a landscape of jagged peaks and deep, lightless valleys. The world outside her parents' home was no longer a place of wonder, but a grid of potential threats. Hypervigilance had become her new baseline. When she went to the grocery store with her mother, her eyes didn't look at the shelves. They tracked the exits, the blind spots in the aisles, and the hands of every man who walked past her. A car backfiring in the street was no longer a noise. It was a physical assault that sent her pulse into a rhythmic, panicking hammer strike. The night was the hardest. In the basement, darkness had been a weapon used against her, and now she could no longer endure it. She slept with every light in her bedroom turned on, the brightness a necessary shield against the black box that waited for her the moment she closed her eyes. Even then, the night terrors were frequent, vivid, sensory-rich descents where she could still smell the copper tang of the concrete and hear the heavy rhythmic thud of David Marsh's boots on the stairs. College, once the bright horizon of her life, had become an impossibility. The University of Wyoming had held her spot, offering every accommodation imaginable, but the mere thought of a lecture hall filled with strangers triggered a claustrophobia so intense she could barely breathe. Crowds were a sea of friendly volunteers waiting for a moment of weakness. Her parents' home, once the launch pad for her independence, had become a sanctuary that was simultaneously safe and suffocating. She lived in a cocoon of protective gazes and soft voices, a life where every choice was monitored for signs of a relapse. The independence she had fought so hard for at 18 had been replaced by a secondary childhood, one where she was tethered by love rather than iron, yet tethered all the same. In May, the police had returned the items recovered from her silver sedan. Among them was her professional camera.
the heavy cannon body she had carried into the park on that final golden afternoon. For weeks, the camera sat in its bag in the corner of her room, a silent black plastic ghost. When she finally summoned the courage to turn it on, she found the last image she had ever framed. It was a shot of Artist Point at sunset, the light hitting the lower falls in a spectrum of amber and violet that seemed too beautiful to be real. It was the image she had never actually taken. She had framed it, adjusted the aperture, and balanced the tripod just seconds before the friendly ranger had interrupted her world. Looking at the digital preview, Mary felt a profound sense of mourning. It was a perfect photograph, a testament to the talent of a girl who no longer existed. She hasn't picked up a camera since. The act of looking through a lens, of choosing what to see and what to exclude, felt too much like the way Marsh had looked at her, as a subject to be captured, framed, and kept. Her therapy sessions focused on the concept of reclaiming autonomy, a word that felt like a foreign language to her. Her therapist spoke about rebuilding identity, but Mary struggled to find the blueprints. She felt like a mosaic that had been smashed and glued back together. The pieces were all there, but the cracks defined the image now. During one session, she reflected on the cost of her survival with a clarity that silenced the room. She realized that she had survived by compartmentalizing the person she was becoming, the ambitious photographer, the trusting friend, the independent woman, and leaving that person behind in the basement so the victim could endure the abuse. Now that she was free, she couldn't seem to find the way back to that original self. She had outlived her captor's plan, but the version of Mary Brooks who had driven into Yellowstone on August 18th was a casualty of the war. The shocking truth that the media had obsessed over, the proximity of her prison, the identity of her captor, had been replaced in Mary's mind by a quieter, more devastating truth. She understood now that some cages don't have bars. They are built out of the permanent rewiring of a nervous system that has learned the world is not a safe place. She was physically free, but her mind was a map where every road led back to the maintenance station. She was a survivor, a title the world gave her with admiration, but to her, it felt like a life sentence. She was the girl who came back, but she was also the girl who would never truly return. In late June, Mary stood at her bedroom window watching the sun dip toward the horizon. From her home in Ohio, the mountains were thousands of miles away, yet she could see them in her mind with a terrifying resolution. She looked out at the familiar trees of her neighborhood, at the fireflies beginning to blink in the dusk, and felt the familiar cold pull of the wilderness. She was free to walk out her front door, free to drive wherever she chose, and free to live a long, quiet life. But as she watched the light fade into the gray-blue of evening, she remained standing by the glass, her hand resting on the lock she had checked 3 times already. She was looking toward the west, toward the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving heart of the continent. She was standing in the light, but part of her would always remain trapped in the 3 miles of woods between the canyon and the station. A ghost of the girl she used to be, still chasing the light in a place where it never quite reached the floor.